Hello, it's Harry Brook, Ag Fieldman from Flagstaff County here, and today we're talking to Joe Harrington, who is the agricultural water specialist with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So, Joe, what do you think producers should consider when they're looking at on-farm water resources?
Well, Harry, I think producers really should take a critical look at their water to really just maximize the benefits and understand that it's an important part of their operation, particularly, economically. If you don't have good water, it's hard to have healthy animals, etc., and therefore hard to make money. So really taking a look at your operation and determining, are you set up correctly?
Right.
We have a tool called the long-term water management plan, and really I think most producers have been doing that type of thing, planning, but maybe just in their head, or sometimes too often they're doing ad hoc measures. But really it's just an idea of just taking a critical look at their operation and really just looking at where they can get a reliable source of water and having it in the right location and having good enough quality. And so those are all critical things. So really taking an inventory of what they have for water sources currently, and then how much water they're using, and then looking at any concerns, so any shortcomings, and what might they do to improve their water security for their operation.
Or even, I imagine it's something you'd use as a tool when you're looking down the road. Say you wanted to expand your cattle herd, right, from 200 to 400 cows or 1,000 cows. That's a consideration. And I guess sometimes that would also require things like drilling new wells, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So really just looking to see, do you have enough water to do that? So if you wanted to expand that herd, double the size, do you actually have enough water? Are you able to access it? So it might be drilling a new well, or maybe several new wells. It may be developing dugouts. It may be just using what you have more efficiently. There's lots of things to consider. And so really taking a good look at it, but really understanding, is that water available before you start doing that?
Committing yourself, yeah.
That's right. So looking at the aquifer, and I would say probably a large majority of producers tend to use groundwater, aka well water.
Yeah.
Just because it is generally a very reliable source. The quality doesn't change very rapidly. In fact, it usually doesn't change much at all. But wells don't last forever, so some producers, sometimes you have to drill a new well to keep the same herd that you had going. But certainly, if you're expanding, you're almost always looking at adding new wells. So really understanding, is that water there? There is the groundwater information database that lists most of the wells in Alberta, and has the information on the geology and generally what the amounts that those wells can produce. So really in your area, you can go look at that in your area and determine, what depths are the wells drilled.
Where do you go for that information?
That's on Alberta Environment and Parks website. They have a website for that.
Okay.
And you could do a search by land location. That's usually the easiest. You can also search by name, although the name has to be is listed under the original owner of the well.
Yeah.
So that's who drilled it. So if you're not the original owner, so not all wells are on there. It wasn't really common to have the wells from before about 1973 on there. So, and there's lots of wells that are older than that are still operating. So that they may not be on there. So you can't count on every well being on there.
I kind of noticed that. I was looking in the county And there was some wells, like it said 1922, but there's absolutely no information on it other than the well, the year it was drilled, and I think the depth of the well, and that was it. Nothing
Mhm.
else.
Yeah, in fact, some of those older wells are actually on there better than the ones that were done in the 50s and 60s. Because they always had a repository, it was done in file cabinets,
Oh
and
yeah.
they put all those in there. But well drillers back in those days were, I guess, tended to send that information in. But later on, they kind of quit doing that until the legislation came in that well drillers, in
Okay.
order to, as part of their license to operate, were required to submit the well drilling reports.
So I guess that'd be your first step. And if you had to put in a new well or you needed some new water and you decided to go with a well, what would be the steps you'd take to sort of make sure you have a well that's a good producer and will provide water for a long time?
Okay, well, so as I said, I kind of want to step back a little bit. First of all, okay, so look at, do you need that well? Is there something else that you could do that you maybe don't have to spend 15, 20, $25,000 on a well? Sometimes you might have other water that's available. So why spend that money? Look at the economics. Is this worthwhile? A common, suggested to different producers that they maybe, if they have a really good well somewhere that will produce way more than they need at that location, maybe they can pipeline that water to the location they need, more economically than drilling a new well. Because the well, you need the power source, whether you're using grid power or
Mhm.
solar power. It's not cheap. So sometimes piping that water, and nowadays, particularly with pasture pipeline plows, that can often be done more economically. But the well has to be a good, viable
Producer, yeah.
producer. If you only have a 3 gallon a minute well, you likely need all that water at that location. So,
Right.
but sometimes in areas where it's really tough to find water, good well water, um, but they have a good well somewhere, that's often the best bet, is to pipeline that water. Having said that, sometimes it doesn't work. Crossing roads and oil and gas pipelines and wetlands and all that other stuff that, it's tricky and can be expensive to do that. So
Right.
you really got to look at all sides of the coin here.
Okay. Well, if you couldn't find a well, I guess your alternative would be to be something like a dugout, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how
Yeah,
do
and
you
so,
set up a dugout that would be sustainable and decent quality water?
well, okay, so planning a dugout it does definitely take some effort. So there's some things to think about. First of all, I guess we have a publication called Quality Farm Dugouts, which you can find on the Government Alberta website. So, and if you're looking for it, you could just do an internet search, Google or whatever your favorite um, tool is.
Hmm.
But look for, type in Alberta and then quality farm dugouts, and that should take you. They should take you right to it. And it's a pretty good publication that can kind of go through some of this. But really, you need to look at, first of all, is putting a dugout somewhere where it can be utilized properly, and also constructing it so that it meets legislation. And so with dugouts, it can be a little trickier to do that, understanding whether it meets legislation or not. Producers are starting to understand better that there's approvals and licensing around dugouts. So often that's a requirement. Also, constructing dugouts in wetlands, there's some things that they have to do around that. If they're going to disturb the wetland, they have to take mitigative measures, and so they can talk to us, which eventually will end up having them apply to Alberta Environment and Parks for an approval to do that construction.
So then you're basically that link in between to help them achieve their goals
Yeah,
and
and
get their
so
whatever the water need is, right?
correct, yeah. So that's one of my roles, and there's 4 agricultural water specialists in the province, and we're a go-between to try. We're a resource to help producers do some of this work.
So do you recommend usually for dugouts that, let's say for livestock watering purposes, do you recommend that they be fenced out and use some kind of an off-site watering system, or
Yeah,
just directly on there? Because I mean, every winter you hear about cases where someone was watering on a dugout and then cattle fell through the ice. It's really, it's a real risk.
absolutely. Yeah, I think industry standard has been changing to where now very many producers use off-source watering systems, so they'll fence it and pump it out. And there's good reason for that. It's generally economics, because I mentioned earlier about water quality. Water quality is important, and if you're allowing direct access into the dugout, the water quality will go down much quicker. The dugout will last a lot shorter. It gets pushed in, slumps in with the cattle mucking around in there, and then the water quality will go downhill generally quite rapidly, just from the bacteria entering, and more is just from the nutrients being input into there from manure and that, and you'll end up with a lot of LJ problems typically.
And not only that, they've done research that shows that if you're off-site watering from a dugout, there's actually an improvement in the pounds of gain you get per acre off the grass.
Yes.
So there's a lot of reasons for keeping it fenced off and controlling traffic on it.
That's right. That's exactly right. And it's been proven time and time again that these off-source watering systems pay for themselves many times over the life of their water source, just from the performance gains in the animals.
Do it right the first time, eh?
That's correct.
Yeah. So with dugouts, every summer there's people talking about do you get algae growth on there because there's phosphorus has got into the water, right? What are the suggested treatments? I know there's still some guys go out there and they'll use bluestone on it, regardless of the algae type.
Yeah, and so that's the best treatment for this is avoidance in the first place. So that is keeping the animals out and that, and trying to avoid it in the first place. Having the BMPs, beneficial management practice, around there. So keeping the cattle out, keeping grass buffers around it so that it tends to filter any nutrients out that for the water, for the runoff that's going in there, those sorts of things. Keeping vegetation out. You certainly don't want any trees around it if you can help it, because the leaves blow into the dugout and decay and cause, and that adds to the phosphorus loading. And when you get a high phosphorus loading, it's very difficult. You're kind of fighting an uphill battle as far as algae. So you can treat it with different products, and typically products that have copper in them are the things that they use in algae. But you need to understand that algae typically isn't the biggest issue. It's actually cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, people know that as blue-green algae, and so we kind of lump them together, but there is a major difference. Cyanobacteria is a bacteria. It looks and acts like an algae, but it's actually a bacteria that can be toxic to animals, and that's what we worry about. And it's typically cyanobacteria. It's very common in dugouts, and algae is actually much less. So the true algae is much less common. Now, cyanobacteria is very sensitive to copper. So you can actually knock the cyanobacteria down with the copper. Unfortunately, when you do that, you kill those cyanobacteria cells, and they release the toxins that's in the cell so often. And that's why you'll see in the information sheets about removing your cattle from that water source for 3 weeks after you treat it with a copper product.
Okay. So it takes that long to break down in the water, eh? So it's no longer toxic.
That's correct. And so that's why it's not because the copper is toxic. In fact, the level of the amount of copper that you would put in would not be would not be toxic to the animals. In fact, a lot of feed supplements have copper in it. So it's because of the toxins in the cyanobacteria. That's why you're doing that.
Okay. What about duckweed? Because there's, I've number of times I've been called saying, I got a problem with algae in my dugout. And if you go out there, oftentimes it's just a mat of duckweed that's floating on the surface. All they see is something green and they think it's algae.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because duckweed. Okay, so the duckweed is using the nutrients in the water, so that phosphorus and any nitrogen in there. That's what it's using, and so it is a sign that you do have a high phosphorus loading. However, duckweed, you could use that as a feed source if you wished. It's not really a problem. In fact, there's things like some of the municipalities will actually kind of seed their sewage lagoons with that to try to remove the nutrients.
Yeah.
And it's not toxic at all. So you don't have to worry about it too much, other than when it dies off, it's going to decompose, which is going to use the oxygen up. And so it's going to go anaerobic or without oxygen, or septic. As a septic tank is just an anaerobic digester, and so that's when you start getting that smelly water, and because there's no oxygen in it. And so you want to avoid that, and you can avoid it by getting rid of those nutrients. So duckweed can actually be used to harvest it off, and that's what these municipalities do. They'll grow a whole mat of it. Then they'll sweep it off, and you can often sweep it off just with a rake or something.
Oh yeah.
But you want to get that material away from the edge of the dugout, and so that it doesn't end up, those nutrients don't end up back in the water.
So it's a way of harvesting the excess nutrients in the water.
Correct.
So would there be any advantage to having duckweed on there as well for, say, keeping the water a little cooler?
So it does that. The problem with it, when you do have a large mat, though, it does sometimes cause problems in that it blocks all the light getting down into the water column. And so anything else that's down there, rooted the submergent vegetation, all that, will sometimes then die. And so then when those die, again, they decompose and start using up the oxygen. So it's always a little bit of a battle to try to keep enough oxygen in the water. And so that's why we also recommend aeration for dugouts. That's always a good thing. And that's really your best. You asked about treatment. Really, the single best treatment you can do for a dugout is after keeping the nutrients out in the first place, is to add aeration to a dugout.
Okay, because then I guess prevents the anaerobic decomposition. So way back when the glaciers were still melting, I remember we were also touting the use of hydrated lime on dugout surfaces to remove the phosphorus. Is there anybody still doing that? And maybe you could talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so hydrated lime, basically you're just coagulating out and having those nutrients settle out, coagulating the phosphorus out of there. And it is workable. The problem with it is that it's pretty labor intensive.
Yep.
There's a lot of stuff around it. The dust is, you need to wear a mask and all that. And I don't know that there's any. There might be a couple in the province of operators that are doing it, but they come into the business thinking, hey, here's a business model, we can make some money, and unfortunately there's no real money to be made in it. And I wish there was. I wish there were more operators, vendors that were doing that, but unfortunately they come and go, and they go more than they come.
Yeah, I found that it was I was involved in a trial up in County Vermilion River, and yeah, it used an awful lot of hydrated lime. What pH do you have to get the water up to basically get the phosphorus to settle out?
I don't recall that, but it's quite high. It gets up quite high. So then you can't use the water for a while after, because the pH has to drop on its own. So as it settles out, and
Yeah.
it takes a while. So we often lose the dugout for a month or so. So that's also a limitation of
Okay.
that.
Yeah,
That
because
type
I
of
remember I think it was pH of 11, possibly somewhere
yeah,
up on there. But it was
yeah,
kind of cool because after you had to apply it, because it's hydrated lime, it doesn't dissolve. It's just in the slurry. So you get this layer of clearing water on the top. It was pretty neat. And as long as you don't add any more phosphorus to the water, it seemed to keep it clear for an extended time. But it was expensive, and as you said, time consuming, and it is actually, hydrated lime will burn you if you're not careful.
absolutely.
What else should we talk about with water?
Well, just really about the whole idea of the quality in general. So really, just
Yeah,
understanding what you have for quality is imperative, because there's no sense drilling a well that supplies water that has some constituent in it that makes it not good for your animals.
like high salt levels, for example.
Yeah, high salts, high sulfates is the biggest one. And
Yeah,
sulfates you can find in well water, but we find the biggest in surface water and dugouts. And I think even in Flagstaff County, I think there's some areas that have high sulfate levels. So, we know the old term alkali. Well, alkali is not really alkali. Alkali
no,
is really is usually it's sodium and sulfates both, and sulfates is the bigger problem than sodium.
yeah,
And so if you have alkali, you've likely got high sulfates, and cattle don't do well on high sulfates.
no,
I think I think the recommended is below 1,000 ppm or milligrams per
yeah,
liter, and cattle can get used to it up to about 2,500 milligrams per liter, or parts per million, whatever you want to call it. But they have to get used to it. You can't take an animal that's never, that's had good quality water and put them on 2,500 ppm,
yeah.
water, sulfates. They just won't do well. But anything above that, you're really looking for trouble, and it'll have lots of, breeding problems and all that
For
sort of stuff.
death.
And in death,
It's
yeah,
because we have had, I remember in the past, phone calls coming in, especially during droughty years, and where those salts get concentrated in the sloughs. And usually the cattle will refuse to drink, but if it's their only water source, they can even take enough on to kill. Because there's been cases, about 5 years ago, I think, where this neck of the woods, there was some cattle basically died because the only water source was a very, very high sulfate laden slough or something.
that's right. And so, yeah, it often happens kind of in certain years. So like you say, when a drought has been there, the big problem we had, I think it was about 2013 or 14, we had a particularly bad year. It was a year where it had been drier the summer before, and then there wasn't much spring runoff. But then we got a lot of runoff, a lot of rainfall in I think May or something like that.
Oh yeah,
It was probably around seeding, as we saw us
the usual. Yeah, why not?
know that. Yeah, and because the ground had it wasn't frozen, like spring runoff, everything is frozen on the ground.
Yeah,
Typically, it runs across the surface, so it doesn't pick up a lot of those constituents, but those minerals. But this particular year, it had thawed, and so then it washed all that. All those, in quotation marks, alkali, all those sulfates into the water sources. And of course, some of these dugouts are right, on the edge of that alkali slough. And so it washed it all in the dugout and put high concentration. Then if you don't get a lot of rainfall after that, or you get a lot of heat and it evaporates out, then those sulfates concentrate in that dugout, because the water evaporates, but the sulfates don't, it just concentrates.
yeah. Okay, well, the way I figure it is, if you haven't got good water, you haven't got an operation, period, or you haven't got a place worth living in.
That's exactly right. And
Yeah,
so really, we'll come back right to the start here, where we talked about planning it out, understanding what you have and don't have, and understanding, what problems might be there, and trying to make a plan to improve your situation.
Yeah. Okay, Joe. Is there anything else you think we should talk about in regards to water? Or that's kind of the quick and the dirty, isn't it?
That's right. I could talk all day, and if everybody was, they'd be switching off by now.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe. If they needed to get a hold of you, you're available, are you?
Absolutely. So we're happy to talk to producers. They can get a hold of us through the Agriculture Information Center. So that's that Ag Info line.
310-3276. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. They send people to us all the time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure, and have a great springtime whenever it decides to show its face.